What if I told you that Sarah's laughter wasn't disbelief, but a cry for help that no one noticed? That behind that muffled smile lay a hidden pain, a spiritual secret that most sermons never touched upon. Today you will discover the real reason why Sarah laughed, a reason so profound, so human, and so divine at the same time that it completely transforms the way we see this story. Because before the miracle, there was silence. Before the promise was fulfilled, there was frustration. And before Sarah smiled with joy, she smiled to avoid crying. And what God did that day reveals not only who Sarah was, but how he deals with people who are wounded, weary, and yet loved. Prepare your heart. The story you are about to hear has never been told to you in this way before. There is a kind of silence that hurts more than any scream. It is the silence of someone who no longer has words to ask for. The silence of someone who has learned to smile while carrying an invisible wound. And Sarah knew this silence well. She was no longer young. The years had passed, one after another, and each one carried the weight of a question that was never answered. Why? Why wasn't the promise fulfilled? Why did God seem so distant just when she needed him to be near the most? Sarah was a barren woman in the Bible, but it wasn't just her body that was empty. It was her hope. The other women had children. They had a future. They had something to leave as a mark on the world. Sarah only had old promises, words that God had spoken to her husband Abraham, but which seemed increasingly impossible to fulfill. And worst of all, no one talked about it. No one asked how she was. Sarah's pain was invisible. She woke up every day with the same emptiness. She prepared meals, tended to the tents, gazed at the horizon, waiting, always waiting. But waiting for so long transforms a person. It transforms faith into doubt. It transforms hope into weariness. And it transforms the heart into something hardened, protected, because the pain again would be unbearable. And it was in this state, in the silence, in the dragging weight, in the seemingly eternal barrenness, that God was about to do something no one expected. But before the promise could be fulfilled, Sarah would have to face something even more difficult, herself. Imagine living alongside someone who carries a promise from God. Sounds glorious, doesn't it? But now imagine that this promise takes decades to be fulfilled. Imagine waking up every day next to a man who heard God's voice say, "I will make you into a great nation." And you are barren. This was the reality for Sarah and Abraham. Two people united not only by marriage, but by a promise that defined them and at the same time consumed them. Abraham was called a friend of God. But Sarah was the woman who couldn't give him the only son who would make the promise possible. And that weighed heavily on her. It weighed on her in a way that the scriptures barely mention, but that anyone who has ever waited for something impossible can understand. They lived as nomads, moving from place to place, always on a journey, always in transition. But the only thing that never changed was Sarah's barrenness. While Abraham built altars and worshipped God, Sarah looked at her own womb and saw only impossibility. She tried to believe, she tried to have faith. But faith is difficult when the body screams the opposite. It was in this context of growing frustration that Sarah made a desperate decision. She offered her servant Hagar to bear a son in her place. It wasn't malice, it was desperation. It was the last resort of a woman who no longer knew how to make God's promise come true. And the result? Pain, jealousy, division. A son was born, Ishmael, but he was not the son of the promise. He was the son of humanity's attempt to force the divine plan. Now, years later, Sarah carried not only the burden of infertility, but also guilt, regret, and the profound feeling that she had ruined everything. The promise seemed further away than ever, and it was at that moment, at the bottom of her emotional and spiritual well, that something unexpected was about to happen. But before you can understand the miracle, you need to understand the pain. Because without the pain, the miracle makes no sense. There is a dangerous place where faith and doubt collide. It's not a place of total disbelief, but it's not a place of certainty either. It's the place where you still believe God can, but you're no longer sure He will. And Sarah was exactly in that place. She hadn't abandoned God. She still followed Abraham. She was still part of the journey. But something inside her had changed. Expectation had given way to resignation. Hope had been replaced by a silent acceptance that perhaps, just perhaps, the promise wasn't for her. Perhaps it was for Abraham. Perhaps God had other plans. But for her empty womb, it seemed too late. And here's the mystery no one told you. God doesn't condemn doubt when it's born from pain. He doesn't reject the heart that struggles to believe when everything around screams impossibility. Sarah's doubt wasn't rebellion. It was exhaustion, and God knew it. Think about how many times you've doubted. How many times have you prayed, waited, believed, and nothing happened? How many times have you felt that God was silent precisely when you most needed an answer? Sarah knew that feeling, and that's why her story is so important, because it shows us that God doesn't abandon those who doubt. He finds them exactly where they are. But Sarah didn't know that yet. She still thought her laughter would be condemned, that her weakness would be rejected. She didn't know that God was about to do something that would change not only her life, but the history of humanity. And it would all begin with an unexpected visit. The divine purpose behind the waiting was about to be revealed, but in a way that no one imagined. It was an ordinary day. The scorching desert sun beat down on the land, and Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent, seeking shade. But what seemed like just another monotonous day was about to become one of the most supernatural moments in the Bible, because 3 men appeared. They were no ordinary travelers. They were no merchants. They were no lost strangers. Scripture reveals that one of them was the Lord Himself, a theophany, a visible manifestation of God in human form, and the other 2, angels, heavenly messengers sent with a specific mission to announce the impossible. Abraham, with the characteristic hospitality of the Middle East, hurried to meet them. He asked for water, had food prepared, slaughtered a calf, and offered fresh bread. And while they ate, a question was asked, a seemingly simple question, but one laden with purpose. Where is Sarah, your wife? That question wasn't casual. God doesn't ask because He doesn't know. He asks because He's about to reveal something. And then came the statement that would change everything. I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Stop, breathe, feel the weight of this sentence. Sarah will have a son. Not maybe, not if she has enough faith, not it depends on her. The promise was declared as a fait accompli. God wasn't asking for permission. He was announcing what He Himself would do. Before we move on to what happened next, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because you'll want to see more Bible stories told this way. Turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. Now, where was Sarah during this conversation? She was listening, hidden. Inside the tent, behind the door, her heart racing and her ears perked. And when she heard that impossible promise, something inside her broke, but not in the way you imagine. Sarah will have a son. 5 words. Just 5, but 5 words that carried the weight of decades of waiting, of accumulated pain, of failed attempts, and of a womb that had long since ceased to be capable of bearing life. 5 words that sounded, at the same time, like the greatest hope and the greatest impossibility Sarah had ever heard. Because, you see, it wasn't just about having a child. It was about having a child at 90 years old. 90. Think about that. This wasn't a young woman hoping for fertility. This was an elderly woman whose body had already gone through all the transformations of aging. The Bible makes it clear Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Genesis 18:11. There was no biological doubt. There was no room for maybe. It was impossible. And that is precisely why the promise was so specific. God didn't say, you will have descendants. He said, Sarah, she specifically by name, will have a son. And furthermore, He gave a time frame. I will return to you in about a year. in the spring, a year, 12 months, enough time for a pregnancy. God was announcing not a distant possibility, but a divine timetable. But here's the part that few realize. This wasn't the first time God promised Abraham a son. He had promised before, several times in fact, but this was the first time he spoke directly about Sarah, the first time he included her name in the promise. The first time he explicitly included her in the miracle that was about to happen. And it was precisely at that moment, that instant of inclusion, of recognition, of being seen and named by God, that something inside Sarah broke, and she laughed. But why did she laugh? What was going through her mind at that moment? That's the answer that will change everything. Sarah laughed. And that laughter became one of the most debated, interpreted, and misunderstood moments in the entire Bible. For centuries, preachers have pointed to that laughter as a sign of disbelief, lack of faith, and unbelief. But was that really the case? The Bible gives us a crucial clue. Genesis 18:12 says, Sarah laughed to herself, thinking, "After I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?" She laughed to herself. It wasn't a loud laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It was a muffled, hidden, intimate laugh. It was the laugh of someone who was alone with her own thoughts. And what did she think? Will I still have that pleasure? Pleasure, not just the possibility of having a child, but the pleasure, the joy, the experience of motherhood that she had always longed for and never had. There was a mixture of desire and disbelief, of wanting to believe but not being able to, of feeling her heart beat with hope and at the same time protecting herself from the pain of yet another disappointment. Because Sarah had been disappointed before, she had waited before, she had believed before, and nothing had happened. So how could she trust again? How could she open her heart to the possibility of a miracle when her heart had already been broken so many times? Sarah's laughter was not contempt for God's promise. It was the reaction of someone who was too tired to believe, too hurt to hope, and too old to dream. It was the laughter of someone thinking, "This is too good to be true. This can't be for me. I've already missed my chance." And here's the detail that changes everything. God heard her laughter. He heard what she thought in silence, what she whispered only to herself, and he didn't let it go unnoticed. But not because he wanted to condemn her, because he wanted to heal her. And then God asked, not for Abraham to find out. Abraham already knew the promise. Not for the angels, they already knew everything. God asked so Sarah could hear, so Sarah could see herself, so Sarah could understand that he was paying attention. Why did Sarah laugh? The voice of the Lord echoed. And then the question that cuts like a sharp blade, is anything too hard for the Lord? Take a deep breath. Feel the weight of this question. It wasn't asked in anger. It was asked with authority, with power, with the intention of confronting not Sarah's faith, but the limit she had placed on God. Because that's what we do, isn't it? When life disappoints us, when promises are delayed, when time passes and nothing changes, we begin to put limits on what God can do. Maybe he can do this, but not that. Maybe he can heal other people, but not me. Maybe he can transform other lives, but it's too late for mine. And it was precisely this limit that God was breaking. He wasn't condemning Sarah. He was freeing Sarah, freeing her from the prison of her own disbelief, weariness, and resignation. He was saying, "Do you think it's too late? I am the God of the impossible. Do you think your body can't? I am the God who creates life where there is none. Do you think I've forgotten you? I am here, pronouncing your name, renewing the promise directly to you." And Sarah was afraid. The Bible says, Sarah was afraid and lied, saying, "I didn't laugh." But God answered, "No, you did laugh." He didn't let her hide it. He didn't let her pretend. Not because he wanted to shame her, but because the truth needed to come out. The wound needed to be exposed, to be healed. And here is the beauty of this moment. God did not reject her. He did not abandon her. He did not say, "Then you don't deserve the miracle." No, he simply said, "I will return at the appointed time, and Sarah will have a son." The promise remained, unwavering, firm, even in the face of her doubt, because God's miracle never depended on the strength of Sarah's faith. It depended on God's faithfulness, and God fulfilled his promise exactly as he said at the appointed time, in the spring of the following year. The impossible happened. Sarah, at 90 years old, conceived. Her womb, which had been dead, came to life. Her body, which had been barren, bore a son. The miracle was not small. It was not discreet. It was resounding, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain by natural means. And when the boy was born, Sarah could not contain her joy. She who had laughed in disbelief now laughed with pure joy. Genesis 21:6 records her words, "God has given me cause to laugh, and all who hear about it will laugh with me." The laughter had changed in nature. It was no longer the bitter laughter of doubt. It was the free laughter of redemption, and the boy's name, Isaac, which literally means "he laughs" or laughter. Every time Sarah called her son, she remembered. Every time someone asked the boy's name, the story was told again. The name Isaac was a living testament that God not only fulfills promises, he even transforms our reactions of doubt into a reason for celebration. Think about it. God could have chosen any name. He could have called the boy Promise Fulfilled or Divine Miracle. But no, he chose a name that directly referred to Sarah's laughter. Why? Because God didn't want her to forget, not to shame her, but to remind her, "I transform everything. Even your laughter of pain, I transform into laughter of joy." Sarah, who had spent decades carrying shame, now carried a son. Sarah, who had been called barren, was now called a mother. Sarah, who had laughed because she didn't believe, now laughed because she had seen the impossible with her own eyes. And every time she looked at Isaac, she saw living proof that God is faithful, always. The miracle did not erase the painful journey, but it gave it meaning. It transformed each tear into testimony, each year of waiting into preparation, each moment of doubt into a foundation for an even greater faith. And here is the revelation that will change how you see this whole story. God never condemned Sarah's laughter. He redeemed it. He transformed it. He took her most human, most fragile, most painful reaction and made it the name of the miracle. This tells us something profound about who God is. He does not reject our weaknesses. He does not despise our doubts. He does not abandon those who struggle to believe. On the contrary, he draws near. He confronts with love. He transforms what was broken into something beautiful. Sarah wasn't a superhero of faith. She was a real woman with real fears, real pain, real frustrations. And that's exactly why God chose her. Because he doesn't need perfect people to fulfill his plans. He needs willing people. People who, even when doubting, continue on the journey. People who, even when tired, don't give up completely. And Sarah's laughter became one of the most powerful lessons in the Bible. God can take the worst moment of our faith and transform it into the greatest testimony of his glory. He can take the laughter of disbelief and transform it into laughter of joy. He can take shame and transform it into honor. He can take barrenness and transform it into motherhood. But more than that, he can take you exactly where you are, with all your doubts, all your weariness, all your frustration, and do something extraordinary. Not because you are strong, but because he is faithful. The laughter that God always planned was not the laughter of perfect faith. It was the laughter of complete redemption. Now tell me, where are you laughing in disbelief? Which promise of God seems too impossible for you? Which dream have you given up on because time passed and nothing changed? Which area of your life have you considered too late? Sarah's story isn't in the Bible just to tell us about a woman who lived thousands of years ago. It's there to show us that God still acts in the same way. He still transforms the impossible into reality. He still fulfills promises even when all seems lost. He still sees, still hears, still acts, especially when we think he is silent. Sarah waited decades. You may have been waiting for months, years, maybe even longer, and the waiting hurts. I know. Waiting is exhausting. Waiting makes you doubt. It makes you laugh in disbelief, like Sarah laughed. But here's the truth you need to hear today. The laughter of doubt is not the end of the story. It's just the beginning of the transformation. Because God does not abandon those who doubt. He confronts them with love. He reminds them, "Is anything too hard for me?" And then in His perfect timing, not our timing, but His perfect timing, He fulfills it. And when He fulfills it, the laughter of sorrow turns into laughter of joy. So don't give up. Don't let go of the promise. Don't let tiredness or the delay convince you that God has forgotten you. He hasn't forgotten. He is working. And when the miracle comes, and it will, you will look back and understand why it took so long. You will understand that the wait was not a waste. It was preparation, and you will laugh. But this time, it will be the laughter that God always planned for you. So, what did you think of this story? Did it touch you in any way? Tell me in the comments. What promise from God are you waiting to be fulfilled in your life? I want to know. And more than that, I want to pray with you. Leave your request below. If this video impacted you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Share it with that person who is tired of waiting, who is struggling to believe, who needs to be reminded that God still performs miracles. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you Bible stories told in a way that will strengthen your faith and transform your perspective. Sarah's story teaches us that God does not reject those who doubt. He transforms them. He takes the laughter of disbelief and turns it into laughter of joy. He takes the pain of waiting and transforms it into a testimony of faithfulness. And He will do that with you too. Because if something is impossible for you, nothing is impossible for God. Remember that. Believe that. And get ready, because your Isaac, your miracle, your fulfilled promise is on its way. May God bless you, and may the laughter of redemption be the hallmark of your story.